Rixiu, Lament of an Old Acorn Gatherer. Deep into autumn, the acorns ripen, scattering as they fall into the hillside scrub. Hunched over, a hoary-haired crone gathers them, treading the morning frost. After a long time, she's got only a handful. An entire day just fills her basket. First she suns them, then steams them, to use in making late winter provisions. At the foot of the mountain, she has ripening rice. From its purple spikes, a fragrance pervades. Carefully she reaps, then hulls the grain, kernel after kernel, like jade earrings. She takes the grain to offer as government taxes. In her own home are no granary bins. How could she know that well over a pickle of rice becomes only 5 pecks in the official's measure? Those crafty clerks don't fear the law. Their greedy masters won't shun a bribe. In the growing season, she goes into debt. In the off-season, sends grain to government vaults. From winter, even into spring, with acorns she tricks her hungry innards. I've heard that Tian Chenzi, by feigning goodness, made himself a king. Ah, in meeting this old woman, acorn gatherer, tears come uncalled to moisten my robe. So today's poem is the child of Pi Rixiu, Shimei, who lived from about 834 to 883. Now, Pi Rixiu is one of the representative Late Tang poets, and he was particularly influenced by the works of Mencius, Han Yu, Bai Yuji. Let's start with a brief biographical outlook of him. He came from south of China, I believe, and passed the examinations. I think it was, I'm not sure of the year, but did not really find the world of the Chinese capital, Chang'an, in the late 9th century a nice place. That was a time when, massive social upheaval was bringing down, or starting to bring down the dynasty, and when only important connections at the capital guaranteed you official positions, even after having passed the examinations. So actually, after his first attempts, Pi Rixiu retreated to the region of Suzhou in the east of China, where he made fast friends with a poet we've already commented, Lu Guimeng. And I think very late in life, during the Huangqiao rebellion, he actually joined the rebel and went back again to the capital to serve under him, but was very quickly executed. He came to a bad end. Yeah. So, as a poet, Pi Rixiu is a paradoxical figure. He is not included in the 300 Tang poems, even though he is relatively important. Professor Nienhauser, in his biography of him, in the Biographical Dictionary of Tang Dynasty Literati, hints that it's probably because the poetry for which he became known was like the poem that I read today, that is, poems of social criticism depicting the suffering of the poor, and these were not particularly favored by the compiler of the Tang, Shi Sanbai Shou. I would have to take another look at the anthology. It avoids very pedantic poems. Probably it also avoids maybe poems that are too straightforwardly pieces of social criticism in the style of the yuefu, which is what happens with this piece. So this is a pretty representative poem of Pi Rixiu's early production. Actually, he has other collections of poetry that are more formalistic and euphuistic from his later years, when he was actually with his friend Lu Guimeng in Suzhou. So he moved away from didacticism and prose towards ornamental aesthetic poetry. And we'll see very briefly an example of this poetry, so different from the poem we've read later on. Okay, what else can we say? Well, this poem is, really, really representative of the yuefu spirit. There's poems that are straightforward of social criticism. Rixiu has had a waxing and waning reputation. He has become very popular, I believe, in the People's Republic of China because of poems like this one, which showed, the concern for the lower classes. And there was even an apocryphal story diffused by PRC critics that he was actually of peasant background, which seems not to have been true. Actually, he was from a local gentry family based in Shangzhou, in Hubei, the same area from which Meng Haoran actually came from. But anyway, whatever his background, this poem, Xiang Ao Tan, the lament of an old acorn gatherer, is very representative of this sort of popular balladry, not particularly hyperbolic. The second half and the late years of the 9th century were a time of real hardship for the peasantry. There were social and economic issues that the Tang had not been able to solve. There were agrarian crises, famines. I mean, the Japanese monk Enin, when traveling in the 840s, reports that in Shandong provinces, people were actually suffering from famine and that acorns were a staple food. So this poem, the gist of it, it's a pretty narrative poem. It tells the story of this old lady who is forced to make a living out of acorns, which are not the appropriate food for a Chinese person. I mean, rice is the staple fare. She in fact, as we read in the poem, which is pretty narrative, she does cultivate rice, but all that rice gets confiscated for paying her taxes, and corrupt officials take more of the officially allotted amount of tax rice, which forces her to live most of the year just by eating acorns, which would have been, I'm not sure if they are the same acorns as our oak acorns, but if they are, it's really complicated to make them palatable. It requires a complicated process of leaching. But anyway, even if it's not them, they're probably not what the Chinese would have considered food, but rather a starvation food. So the topic of the poem is social criticism. It's depicting the life of the lower classes, particularly of a woman who, in spite of working hard, being old, and working in the rice fields, is forced to live on acorns, mainly because of excessive and corrupt taxation and officials. And, this pretty well represents the real situation in late Tang China, which would lead to the Huangchao rebellion and to the collapse of the dynasty. Okay, we don't think there's a pretty relatively long poem compared to others that we have seen. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. It's 26 pentasyllabic lines in the original Chinese. So as I said, the topic is quite standard. I would divide the poem probably into 2 parts. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's the first 12 lines, that is those first 6 couplets, depict the life of this woman. The remaining part of the poem explains why she has been driven to this situation of having to make a living out of acorns. It's basically because of the corruption of the petty officials. And finally, you could say that the last couplet, or the last 2 couplets, round it up with a historical example on how the officials of the Tang are even worse and more corrupt than those of the ancient kingdom of Qi. So let's very quickly go over it. So the first part, the first 6 couplets. Deep into autumn the acorns ripen, scattering as they fall into the hillside scrub. Hunched over, a hoary-haired crone gathers them, treading the morning frost. After a long time, she's got only a handful. An entire day just fills her basket. First she suns them, then steams them, to use in making late winter provisions. At the foot of the mountain she has ripening rice. From its purple spikes the fragrance pervades. Carefully she reaps, then hulls the grain, kernel after kernel, like jade earrings. So The first part of the poem explains the life of this woman. It's sad. We have an autumn setting to begin with, which always conveys melancholy. But we see her hard life, spending an old lady, spending all her day collecting acorns and only getting as much as a basketful out of a long, grueling session of work. And we get her then preparing them. And then a mention to rice. And she also cultivates rice. And she doesn't just collect acorns, which are, well, they're not cultivated. They're natural produce. But she also works in the rice, and she polishes it. And interesting how the rice, the kernels are described as like jade earrings, with a fragrance. This vocabulary seems to evoke, seems to jar a bit with with a realistic and popular context. It seems to evoke those images that typically appear in palace poems of jade earrings and perfumed fragrances. Maybe there's an irony in the use of these images. Okay, so the second half of the poem, why is this woman having to work for rice and having to spend all day in autumn collecting acorns? Well, it's basically because the state is greedy and extortionate. She takes the grain to offer as government taxes. In her own home are no granary bins. How could she know that well over a pickle of rice becomes only 5 pecks in the official's measure? Those crafty clerks don't fear the law. Their greedy masters won't shun a bribe. In the growing season she goes into debt. In the off-season sends grain to government vaults. From winter even into spring, with acorn she tricks her hungry innards. So, corrupt officials, the tax collectors, so in this time taxes, in case of lower classes of a farmer, are mainly paid in species, not in coin necessarily, but in cereals, in this case rice, or maybe linen or other products from a household. So the woman has to take almost all of her rice and use it for paying taxes. Now, she has no bins for storing rice at home because all of it gets confiscated. And outrageously so. The officials are using cheating, they are using fake measures so that even though she pays or brings around pickles of rice, for every pickle of rice, it only counts in the officials' registers as 5 pecks. So they are swindling her and keeping, they are overtaxing her and, making the difference their profit, which they might have to detract amounts for bribing officials higher than themselves. So a world of corruption which exploits this old lady and the poor people in general and makes them have to live without rice and spending hunger. And finally, the last 2 couplets. I've heard that Jiang Chengzi, by feigning goodness, made himself a king. In meeting this old woman, acorn gatherer, tears come uncalled to moisten my robe. We get the emotion of sadness of the poetic persona, the scholar official, at this exploitation of the poor classes, which is unhumane and unnatural. And we get a historical reference, the only one in a poem that is pretty transparent. So Jiang Chengzi was a minister of the old state of Qi that ingratiated himself with the population by doing exactly the opposite of what the Tang officials are doing to this old lady. He used smaller measures than the ones that were appropriate for measuring the tax grain that the peasants handed over to him, and he used measures that favored them in the other way for giving to other people. And this was a strategy. Jiang Chengzi used this basically to make himself popular with the people of the state of Qi, and I'm not sure if it was him or one of his descendants later usurped and deposed the ruling dynasty in Qi and became kings themselves. But even this scheming and manipulating politician is better in this poem than the late Tang officials, who are just wicked and corrupt. Their practices are much worse than those of Tian's. So that's a poem of social criticism, and an interesting one to relate to other poems in the series, and to show us what this type of yuefu actually looks like, which we haven't seen that much in the 300 Tang poems. Although some of Du Fu's poems, they're not yuefu, but they have this this concern with the lower classes in them. A very different poem, for example, to contrast is his more aestheticist pieces from late in his life, like Chong Ti Chiang Wei, again on the rose. It's just a couplet, a heptasyllabic couplet. It's just describing a rose. And it goes like this. Thick, like an orangutan's blood, just smeared on a white cloth. Light, as the swallows, intending to fly to the empyrean. What a pity this delicate beauty can scarcely stand the sun. It throws its rays upon the deep reds, fading their hues.